Hi everyone. So today we're going to talk a pretty good topic about red teaming on critical infrastructure. So to kick off things, who am I? So I'm Granit. I currently work at KPMG. So I'm a security engineer. I deal with red teaming, pen testing, and I've been doing that for the past 6 years. I moved recently in the UK. I moved actually last year. So it has been treating me very well. And considering that English is not my main language, I try to keep it as simple as possible and try to explain every question that you may have in the end. And I love to play dots as a hobby. So right to the topic. So what is red teaming? What is pen testing? What's the main difference? And so a normal company would normally engage on a pen test, on a penetration testing to complete the compliance requirements, to test the solution, the web app, mobile app, etc. But a red teaming is more complex one because it is more functioned on enterprise level. So a company that has in place a security operations center, a blue team, and you try to check if the responsive of that blue team is more than enough to suffer a cyber attack. So a penetration testing is a main focus would be to find as many vulnerabilities as you can and report that. The blue team may be aware of it and it will not make much noise. And they do not worry about getting detected. They often got issues when they perform a red team penetration testing, and it takes a small amount of time to complete it. So it takes just 1 to 3 weeks. In more complex infrastructures, like a more complex solution, it will take maybe like up to a month, but not more than that. Red teaming is you try to get inside the main infrastructure, the domain controller, the critical points of your infrastructure as soon as possible. So at the earliest stage, and they will try and mimic a threat actors group. So APTs, the advanced persistent threats. So they try and mimic that along the way. So they will use different frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK framework, and it will try and mimic their sessions and their parts on what they can do on that step. And it takes a lot of time to perform red team assessments. The minimum is going to take 1 to 3 months, but for critical infrastructure in this place, it can take from 6 months to a year to fully complete it. So what is a critical infrastructure? So critical infrastructure has everything that is crucial about our life. So the supply chain, the food, government, banking, or the financial sector, transportation system, nuclear reactors and materials and waste, the energy sector, the water supplies, and everything. So everything that actually brings us a basic stuff into our life, it's very crucial, because once that chain is broken, then it's going to cause panic, chaos, and a lot of things that we cannot imagine. So how do we approach red teaming, especially the methodology? So it always starts with a reconnaissance. So recon is the main important bit on every engagement, even on pen testing, even on red teaming, and the open source intelligence. So then you move out the one that differs from the pen testing, which is physical access. So on a traditional pen test, you will not have physical access checkings and assessments, but on red teaming is kind of an important one to gain initial access. And then once you have done that, you will try and gather as much information about the infrastructure and the architecture, and you will try and establish a foothold, initial access, even if that's a 0-day CVE exploit or anything that you can find along the way. And once you got your steps in, and usually these 3 steps takes the most of the time, like 4 months to complete. And then you move to lateral movement. This is, of course, it's going to be hard to move laterally, especially on a critical infrastructure environment, because it's going to be isolated from the network. It's going to have its own network. It's going to have its own communication protocols. It's going to have not usual things that you were used to see when you performed, for example, a pen test. You're not going to have a website to hack your way in. You have to use your social engineering skills and stuff. And then let's consider that you moved laterally, you got access to the domain controller, you will have the crown jewels. We call the crown jewels the most critical parts of an infrastructure. So, for example, in the critical infrastructure is going to be a SCADA system, which we are going to talk lately. But these four that I highlighted in red are the important bits when you perform red team assessment on a critical infrastructure, for example, a power grid. So you'll have to gain physical access first. You cannot perform reconnaissance from the outside. You cannot find anything on the internet. So you have to get your way in. You have to use tailgating, masquerading, any technique that you can have. I have seen on B-sides lockpicking, where it is very useful when you try to get in, especially on for example, a power grid station. And you can use unauthorized connections like rubber ducky USBs. You can use a flipper zero. You can use a hack RF when my colleague displayed earlier at the presentation. And then you can access the crown jewels. But what's the kind of the most important one, and the biggest vulnerability that you can see in a critical infrastructure is the human error. It's always going to be on top on everything when it comes to cybersecurity. Humans are made to make mistakes, so that's the reason why. So what's the most important part, as I mentioned, it's the SCADA system. So what's the SCADA? So it's a supervisory control and data acquisition. Let's consider it as a server which connects everything into one place, from PLCs and RTUs, where it gathers like gibberish information and it translates them to human language. And in this case, it's going to be the human-machine interface. So in a SCADA system, there are three main components. It's HMI, RTUs, and PLCs. The human-machine interface is the one that you could see, for example, on movies, like the big screen, the monitors, the monitoring room of that critical infrastructure. For example, let's take a power grid. So when you can see like 8 screens and they monitor the temperature, the valves, the sensors, the humidity and stuff, that's what HMI does. So it has a beautiful dashboard where you can see and manage everything. And RTUs is something that will transfer the data from level 0, which is the programmer logic controllers. So it gathers information from that one and transfer that to the SCADA server, which will then it brings up to the HMI. So how can we utilize MITRE ATT&CK for red teaming on critical infrastructure? MITRE ATT&CK is the most famous framework when it comes to red teaming and mimicking a threat actor, an APT group, even if that's going to be anonymous or fancy bears on any APT that you can name it. But they do have one thing. MITRE ATT&CK released MITRE ATT&CK framework for ICS, for critical infrastructure. So it differs a lot from performing red teaming on a simple one. You can go and check it out yourself. You can play with it. It has a GitHub link also inside the MITRE ATT&CK ICS framework. And you can see a lot of difference between the usual one, because it does have firmware update mode and checking, for example, exploits that are not known on the internet. And yeah, the famous one, the one that break the world. I think that's the best title that I could find, because 500 kilobytes that changed the world. It's the Stuxnet. I think everyone is familiar with Stuxnet. Everybody has heard it. Everybody maybe have seen it in the movies. So it did happen on Iran on 2010. Its main target was a nuclear facility, and the main target was the programmer logic controllers. In this case, it was produced by Siemens. So how it did happen? They got initial access by mounting a flash drive, a USB, into the network, because that was isolated fully, completely. And even though Iran said that they were prepared for any cyber attack, but this took, I think it took about 5 years of development to develop such a worm that it will act in autonomous way inside the end. So what it does, it will go inside, what it did do, sorry, it goes inside the system using a USB flash drive mount, and that's how it was delivered. Then it will go and in its own way, it will check if it's a Windows server, if it's a Siemens PLC. What it does, it has a list of vulnerabilities, 0 days, certificates, everything that you can imagine, like a long sheet of vulnerabilities inside that small flash drive, and it will try and exploit every vulnerability that they could find along the way on any server. And once they got access, then a TCP connection was performed with the CNC server, and also they used command and control to exploit stuff. And then the main point, when they moved laterally, they used 0 days, they used vulnerabilities, they used everything. Then they managed to get inside the centrifuges. So what they did inside the centrifuges, they were doing it like now, what we call it time frame attacks. So basically they will heat it up, wait 30 minutes, heat the centrifuge up, wait 30 minutes. And then that caused the explosion. And for the HMI, for the people working on the human-machine interface on that day, it was pretty much too late to understand what's happening, because the worm was sending fake signals to the HMI. So people thought that the temperature is fine, and it's nothing to worry about. And I think this one it's a good one because it was released 10 days ago. So these are the latest CVEs exploits that you can find for critical infrastructure. For example, some of them are even accessible through remote connection, so you even don't have to get inside the critical infrastructure to perform those. So, for example, in Delta Electronics, it has a vulnerability that allows you to execute RCE, remote command execution. And we do have, for example, the CVE of 5885 for FFS Colibri, which is a fuel inventory system, management system. And then you can gather inside access. Like, imagine this one is kind of the honeypots where every attacker would look like in a critical infrastructure. So if you're trying to find your way in every time on the critical infrastructure engagement, you'll have to check the CVE directory, first of all, because critical infrastructure systems are old ones. They often do not get upgraded because it is very costly. And that's the reason why they try to isolate it as much as possible from the outside world, so no one could gain access and understand what's happening. And thank you. Any questions and answers are more than welcome.
Thank you. So I was just wondering, obviously you need to get physical access. Have you seen situations where that physical access hasn't been possible?
Yeah. So that's the reason why in most cases on red team engagements, we have get out of the jail card, it's called. So when you try to get physical access inside especially, for example, critical infrastructure, most of the people get caught by police or the security guards. So you just pop up the get out the jail card, so you will not be convicted and prosecuted. So that's the main thing that you're trying to avoid. But yeah, it happens most of the times, and when is that done, you have to try it again. So that's the only way. Yeah.
I was also wondering, you see like in architecture threat, like the Purdue model and stuff, where you try and keep untrusted on one side of a firewall. I wouldn't know if you could talk about the efficacy, like how good these models are, if they work or not, if you know.
So the main problem on a critical infrastructure based on my engagements, it was the misconfigurations of the communications, because PLCs and the RTUs, remote terminal units, use something called Modbus. Modbus is a communication like TCP. Let's say, for example, it does have also TCP. It's a communication that happens from PLCs to the RTUs to transfer them to HDMI. So that is the main important bit, because in the Modbus connection, if you find something, if you are enabled to perform man in the middle, for example, or capture that packet and see what's happening, then that's the game over.
Any other questions? Last one at front here.
Hi, great talk, thank you. Just a question, when you're red teaming on critical national infrastructure, if there is a chance that, or when you want to get into something, or even get going, and you need to run an exploit and there's a very high likelihood of it going down, what do you do just so that you can get an assumed breach foothold?
Yeah, so that's also a good question and a good problem that we actually encounter when to perform it, because you're not trying to break something when you're performing a red team assessment. So to perform an assumed breach scenario on a critical infrastructure, we usually gather the architecture information of that critical infrastructure and try to mimic that on our labs and any test environment that they do have, because every facility has its own test environment where they kind of pre-check things before they do it in production. And if that is exploited on a test environment, it's considered that it works on there, because we are not trying to break things up.
Cool. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.